I stood at the edge of the stage, watching the sea of faces below me, all the families cheering and clapping, their excitement humming in the air like a pulse. The stadium was packed, students in their caps and gowns, their proud smiles brighter than the sun overhead. It should have been the perfect moment, the culmination of 2 years of sleepless nights, endless assignments, and working 2 jobs just to keep my head above water. I should have been basking in the glory of a master's degree in business administration. But when my name was called and I took that slow walk across the stage, all I could feel was a hollow ache in my chest. I looked for them, my dad, my brother, but the family section was empty. The rows of seats where they should have been were just that, empty. I swallowed, tried to force a smile, and waved, but it was just a reflex, a practice gesture that had long ago become automatic. As I shook the dean's hand and turned to head back to my seat, a part of me wanted to scream. Where were they? My father had promised he'd be here. He promised me everything would be different this time. And yet, here I was, alone, again. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled out into the courtyard. I lingered in the corner, phone in hand, scrolling through texts, pretending I had somewhere to be, something to do. I could feel the sting of the empty space beside me, where my family should have been. But I ignored it. A familiar voice broke through my thoughts. "Hey, Jack! Congrats, man!" Kyle said, clapping me on the back. He smiled, wide and genuine. "How's the family? They here?" I blinked, my brain racing for a lie. Yeah, they're running late. You know how it is." The words slid out with practiced ease, like they always did. Kyle didn't seem to notice. "Yeah, I get that. I'll catch you later." He turned to walk off, and I stood there for a moment longer, feeling the space around me close in. I left the stadium, got into my old car, and sat in the parking lot for a while, watching families celebrate, snap photos, and make memories. I let myself imagine for a second, just a second, what it would have been like if my father and brother had actually shown up, balloons and flowers in hand. I could almost see them walking toward me, smiling. But it was just a dream, a vision that faded faster than it had appeared, leaving me alone in the quiet hum of the parking lot. It wasn't the first time. It wasn't even close. There had been so many days when I'd been the one keeping things together, working 2 jobs during college, sending money back home, making sure my father didn't feel like a failure. But in the end, he never noticed, never showed up for the important stuff. But he sure showed up when it came to asking me for money. It always came down to that. This day, this should have been about me, but it wasn't. It was about them, just like always. The excitement from graduation was already starting to fade, like smoke disappearing into the air. I sat on the couch in my apartment, my cap and gown still draped over the chair, but I couldn't bring myself to unpack them. The day felt like a hollow victory, and the weight of it pressed harder with every minute. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a text from my dad. "Hey, need $2,000 for your brother's birthday party. Let me know. No congratulations, no proud of you. Just the same demand he always made, like I was nothing more than a cash machine." I stared at the screen, the words swimming in front of me as the familiar knot of anger tightened in my chest. $2,000 for a birthday party? My younger brother didn't need that kind of party. Hell, none of them needed anything from me anymore. It wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that even on the one day I should have been celebrated, I was still nothing more than an ATM to them. I felt the familiar sting of being used, of being expected to give and give while they never showed up for the important moments in my life. The sting was sharp, but this time, something in me snapped. Without even thinking, I shot back a response. "Congrats on your brother's party." And I sent $1, one single dollar. Then, before my finger could hesitate, I deleted the message. Deleted the follow-up too, the one asking if I could send the rest soon. I wasn't going to play that game anymore. I sat back in my chair, staring at my phone, that bitter taste still lingering on my tongue. It was like a switch flipped. The anger didn't burn so hot anymore. It settled into something else, something that felt like calm, like I was finally done. I reached over and grabbed the spare key my father had insisted I keep all these years. His idea of just in case when he needed something. I ran my thumb over the key, feeling the weight of it for the last time. Without a second thought, I walked over to the trash can and dropped it in. The silence in the room felt heavy for a moment, but I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I was doing something that wasn't for them. It wasn't to fix their problems or be their safety net. It was for me. I grabbed my phone again, no longer thinking about what my father would say or how he'd react. I called a locksmith. The decision felt freeing, like the first breath after holding it in too long. The locks would be changed and I wouldn't have to worry about him showing up uninvited anymore. A part of me was almost surprised by how easy it felt. I wasn't used to standing up for myself. I was used to being the one who fixed things, made it right. But now I was breaking free. The locksmith was scheduled to arrive in the next hour. As I waited, I picked up a book I'd been meaning to read but had never gotten around to. I couldn't focus on it though. My mind was too busy racing, replaying every moment I'd let my father's demands push me around. When the locksmith finally knocked, it felt like the first step to something bigger, like I was finally doing something real for myself. But as he changed the locks and I handed over the payment, a thought gnawed at me, a quiet warning I couldn't ignore. It wouldn't be easy. I could already feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just the locks I'd changed. It was the door I was closing on everything I had ever been for my family. And I knew they wouldn't let me go that easily. That night, the apartment felt quieter than I expected, and for a second, it felt almost too peaceful. I sank into the couch, the weight of the day slowly pulling me down, the tension from everything finally starting to unwind. The locks had been changed. I wasn't worried about anyone barging in anymore. I didn't have to pretend anymore. It was just me, finally free from all the noise and the demands. But then, there was a knock at the door. I froze for a second. My heart picked up its pace, a nervous beat. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe it was someone I had forgotten about. I stood up and walked over, peering through the peephole, trying to make sense of the shadowed shapes standing outside. 2 police officers. My stomach dropped. I opened the door, and they didn't even wait for an invitation. They just stepped inside. One of them, a guy with a solid build and a serious face, flashed his badge. "Mr. Reed?" he asked, his voice flat but not unfriendly. "Yeah, what's going on?" "We're here because we received a call from your father," the officer explained. "He's concerned about your well-being. Said you've been acting erratically and might be in danger of harming yourself." I stared at him, incredulous. My father? The same guy who didn't show up for my graduation? The one who demanded money like it was his right? He was worried about me? "Are you serious?" I shot back, my voice tight. "That's ridiculous." The second officer, a woman with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, stepped forward, calm as ever. "We're just here to check in. Can we come inside and make sure you're all right?" I nodded stiffly, trying to mask the shock. They stepped in, their boots scuffing the floor, and I could feel the weight of their eyes on me. They glanced around, taking in the coffee on the table, the neatness of the place, the lack of anything that screamed danger. I couldn't help but feel a little insulted. This is what he did? Called the cops on me like I was a kid again? They were polite enough, asking me simple questions. How had I been feeling lately? Was I depressed? Did I have thoughts of hurting myself? I shook my head, each question cutting through me, making me feel smaller. "No," I said firmly. "No issues. Just need some space, some boundaries." The officers exchanged a look, but said nothing. After a minute, the woman nodded, her tone softening a little. "All right, if you're sure, we'll leave it at that." The man turned to go, then paused at the door. "Just one thing, Mr. Reed," he said, almost like an afterthought. "Sometimes, when people start standing up for themselves, others panic." I stared after them, the door closing with a soft click behind them. Panic. That's what this was? My father panicked because I wasn't playing the role he had carved out for me anymore? A cold feeling settled in my chest. The idea that my father would go this far, call the cops, paint me as unstable, just to keep me in line, just to force me back into his control, was sickening. They thought I was fine. They saw through the lie, through the facade my father had put up. But I didn't know how far he'd go to keep me in his grip, how far he would push before I broke. I stood there for a long time after they left, the silence in the room louder than any words. It was clear now. He wouldn't just let me go. He would try to sabotage me, any way he could. And now, I had no choice but to figure out how far I was willing to go, to finally be free. The morning after the cops showed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping cold coffee, staring at the laptop in front of me. It was quiet in the apartment. Too quiet. I felt like something was creeping, like a storm waiting to break. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I opened my credit report anyway. Maybe I was just being paranoid. The report loaded, the little spinning circle making me anxious. Then, my eyes landed on something. 2 new credit inquiries. One from Capital One, another from Discover. My stomach twisted. What the hell? I clicked through, the unease growing as I scrolled. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a couple of new credit checks for a car loan or something. But that wasn't what I found. No, the inquiries were tied to 2 new credit accounts, both opened in my name. I leaned in closer, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The accounts weren't just random, they were for thousands of dollars. Thousands! And then it hit me. I saw the charges, event venue, catering, decorations, all for my brother's birthday. I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse, my blood running cold. I stared at the screen, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some random stranger using my name. This was my father. He had used my identity. He had opened credit cards in my name and racked up charges, all to pay for a party, a birthday party. I slammed the laptop shut, my breath shallow. I was shaking. This wasn't just manipulation anymore. This was criminal. I had no idea how deep his grip on me went. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't a mistake. He had done this on purpose. I stood up, pacing the small apartment, running my hands through my hair. My mind raced. I didn't know what to do. The only thing I could think of was to call Capital One. I grabbed my phone, my fingers numb, and dialed the number on the back of my card. A few minutes later, I was on the line with a representative, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hi, I'm calling about a couple of accounts opened under my name. I didn't authorize these." I paused, feeling the weight of every word. The representative was calm, polite. He asked for my information, then pulled up the accounts. "Okay, I see the 2 accounts. One with Capital One and one with Discover. Both opened at a branch in the same town where your parents live, and it looks like your father used your information as the primary account holder," he said, his voice matter of fact. My stomach dropped, a sick feeling spreading through me. He hadn't just opened the accounts, he'd used my name, my credit, to get what he wanted. And now he'd left me to clean up the mess. I could barely hear the rest of what the representative was saying. When I hung up, the weight of it all hit me full force. I didn't know what the hell I was supposed to do next, but I knew one thing. I couldn't just let this slide. The calm I'd felt yesterday had completely disappeared, replaced by a rage that burned through me like wildfire. I had to fight back. This wasn't just about my father's entitlement anymore. This was about my identity, my life, and I wasn't going to let him steal that too. I picked up my phone again, this time to make a call to a lawyer. It was time to take control, to stop pretending everything would just work out on its own. But as I hit dial, I realized something else. My father had no idea how far I was willing to go to make him pay for what he'd done. I called my father and told him to meet me halfway, at a diner about 20 minutes from my apartment. He didn't ask why. He didn't even ask where. He just agreed. I'm sure he thought I was coming to smooth things over, to apologize for whatever mistake he'd convinced himself I'd made. But I wasn't there to fix anything. I was there to put an end to it. When I slid the folder across the table, I could see his eyes flicker. He didn't even look at me first. He opened the folder, pulling out the documents, the proof, the credit inquiries. He went quiet as he flipped through the pages, his face hardening, his jaw tightening. But he didn't look surprised, not even a little bit. He knew exactly what I was showing him. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, he set the papers down and looked at me. "You're blowing this way out of proportion, Jack," he said, his voice low but defensive. I didn't blink, didn't flinch. "No, I'm not. These accounts are in my name. You opened them without my permission, and you're the one who's been racking up thousands of dollars. You're not just manipulating me anymore, Dad. This is fraud." I paused, watching him carefully, waiting for him to speak, but he didn't. He was staring at the table now, tapping his finger, clearly trying to figure out what his next move would be. I pushed forward, not giving him a chance to weasel out of it. "The bank is investigating it. The authorities are involved. This isn't something I'm going to just let slide." He looked up at me then, eyes narrowing, his expression shifting to something darker. "You think this is all on me? You think I'm the one who's ruining everything?" I shook my head, my anger simmering just under the surface. But I stayed calm. I don't think this is all on you, Dad, but I'm not going to take the blame for your mess anymore. This isn't about me ruining the family. This is about you using me until there's nothing left." His face turned red. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "You have no idea what I've been through, Jack. I've been doing what I had to do for this family, and you are going to sit here and accuse me of ruining everything?" His voice rose, a harsh, bitter edge to it. I stayed quiet, my hands steady on the table. I knew what was coming. He was going to try to twist it all around, turn this into my fault. It always worked before, didn't it? "I didn't ask for this, Dad," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I didn't ask to be the one you came to for everything. I didn't ask to be your fallback, your safety net. You've been using me my whole life, and I'm done." He slammed his hand down on the table. The sound echoed in the small booth, making a few heads turn in our direction. I didn't care. I was done hiding. "You're ruining the family!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "You're turning your back on us, after everything I've done for you." I stared at him. For a long, long moment, I said nothing. And in that silence, I realized something. His rage wasn't about regret. It wasn't about him realizing what he'd done. It was about him losing control, losing me. And that was the one thing he couldn't stand. I stood up, sliding the folder back into my bag. I wasn't going to argue with him anymore. The fight was over. "You want to know what I'm ruining?" I said, my voice quieter now but firm. "I'm ruining the version of me that you've been using for years. And I'm not sorry about it." I turned, walking toward the door. As I stepped out, I heard him call after me, his voice hoarse and full of fury. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The door slammed behind me, and for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of his anger lift off my shoulders. 3 days after the confrontation, I was still feeling the tension in my bones, the kind that doesn't fade even when you think it's all over. I was sitting at my desk, scrolling through emails, trying to get a handle on the mess at work when my phone rang. It was my younger brother. I knew this call was coming. I didn't want to pick it up, but I did anyway. "Jack," he said, his voice sharp, like a blade slicing through the silence. "What the hell happened? Why did the police show up at the party? Why the hell is Dad being investigated for fraud?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen in front of me, but my mind was elsewhere. I wasn't surprised by his anger. I expected it. He was always the one who was shielded from the chaos, the one who got to live in the fantasy that everything was fine. But I didn't answer him, not right away. "You gonna say something or just sit there?" he demanded, his voice louder now. "You ruined everything, Jack. You couldn't just let things be, could you? You had to go and make it all public. Now, look what you've done." I didn't respond. I wasn't going to. I didn't owe him an explanation. The silence between us stretched out, and it felt like the most honest thing I'd done in years. He kept talking, his words getting more frantic, accusing me of destroying the family, but I didn't listen. Not anymore. I was done. Finally, I hung up. No words, no apology, just the click of the phone ending the call. I let out a slow breath, and for the first time in days, I felt some peace. That storm inside me, the one that had been raging for so long, had started to quiet down. The fallout from everything was starting to spread, like wildfire. People at work were whispering. I overheard a few of them talking one day in the break room, disbelief clear in their voices. "Can you believe what his dad did?" one of them had said. "Opening credit cards in his name? That's low." Another had muttered something about how Jack Reed was the last person they thought would be involved in something like that. I couldn't care less. The whispers didn't bother me. What mattered was that they were finally hearing the truth. It wasn't just me anymore. It was the story that was bigger than anything my father could spin. I watched as everything around my father started to crumble. The bank was pursuing legal action. His name was getting dragged through the mud, and the fraud investigation was only intensifying. It felt almost surreal, watching it all happen from the outside. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. This was the reckoning. But the truth wasn't easy to swallow for my brother. I knew that. His anger wasn't really about the money or the party or the mess Dad had created. It was about the image of the perfect family he'd held onto so tightly, the picture-perfect version of our lives that had been shattered the minute I stepped out of line. He didn't see the truth, not yet, and maybe, just maybe, he never would. But I was done waiting for him to catch up. This was my fight now, and the only thing I knew for sure was that I wasn't going to lose. 6 months had passed since I cut ties with my family, but it felt like a lifetime ago. My new apartment was small, but it was mine. It was quiet, and for the first time, I didn't dread coming home. The walls weren't filled with the noise of expectations, the guilt, or the pressure to be someone I wasn't. I'd focused on my career, and it was paying off. I'd been promoted recently, the recognition feeling like a solid step forward. The work was still hard, but it was mine, and I didn't feel like I was being weighed down by everyone else's baggage. I was no longer the good son. I was just Jack, finally. The silence I once feared, it was my peace now. It wasn't the emptiness that came from being ignored or left out. It wasn't the silence of waiting for someone to show up and finally see me. It was the silence of knowing I was standing on my own, not needing anyone to approve or fix me, and that felt good. I hadn't heard from my father since the day we parted ways. I knew what was happening on his end, the legal paperwork, the fraud charges, the fallout. It had been impossible to ignore the headlines when the story spread. There was a small part of me that had braced myself for him to try to reach out, to pull me back into his mess. But nothing came. No phone calls, no texts, nothing. It was like he had finally stopped pretending to care, and I wasn't sure if that was a relief or a loss. But the truth was, I didn't miss him. Not in the way I thought I would. Not in the way I used to convince myself I needed him. I was finally living a life where I didn't feel like I was just a stepping stone for someone else. I wasn't the backup plan, the safety net. I was in control now. Of course, it came with a price. I'd lost my brother, at least for now. His anger, the rage he'd thrown at me that day was still there, and I knew he probably hated me for what I had done. But that wasn't my burden anymore. If he couldn't see past the image of the perfect family we had once been, that was his choice, not mine. I wasn't responsible for holding up a lie. And as for my father, well, the truth had finally caught up with him. The fraud charges, the money he'd stolen, everything had unraveled. He was facing consequences now, and I was standing on the other side, finally free from the web he'd trapped me in for so long. The old man had learned the hard way that freedom didn't come cheap, but for the first time, I was living in it. For the first time, I wasn't losing.